I'm delighted to be joined in the studio now by Lord Agnew, who was the Anti-Fraud Minister in the Cabinet Office from 2020 to 2022. Prior to that, he was Schools Minister. Now, Lord Agnew will perhaps be best known to many of our viewers for your dramatic resignation from your role as an Anti-Fraud Minister in the House of Lords last January. You said that the government had been too lax in awarding COVID bounce-back loans and were not doing enough to investigate them retrospectively. Let's just remind ourselves of that moment.
Total fraud loss across government is estimated at 29 billion a year. Of course, not all can be stopped, but a combination of arrogance, indolence and ignorance freezes the government machine. Action taken today will give this government a sporting chance of cutting income tax before a likely May 2024 election. If my removal helps that to happen, it will have been worth it. So it leaves me only to thank the noble Lord Tunnicliffe for his courteous but attentive role as my shadow minister of my portfolio, and to thank noble friends, many of whom I know will carry on their scrutiny of this important area. Thank you and goodbye.
It's the closing of the book. Right, I'm off. You were clearly incensed by what you saw as Treasury inaction over COVID loan fraud. What went wrong?
Well, it was panic initially. That they were very worried that the productive economy would be destroyed by the forced closure of millions of business with COVID, which was a perfectly reasonable reaction. But they then just closed their ears to sensible suggestions that could have dramatically reduced the amount of fraud that emanated from the loan schemes that they put in place.
Why do you think they did that? Was it a case of, oh, well, you know, we've got bigger fish to fry, we're just going to have to just close our eyes to what's going on because it's too big to solve?
Well, I honestly don't know, because I literally had shouting matches with them. I mean, I was so frustrated at the time when they put the loan structure in place, and I warned them that they were creating an absolute nightmare for the future, and that the excuse was a few credit checks would unreasonably delay getting the money out to these businesses, which is total rubbish. I mean, it would have delayed it by a few hours, literally. There were something like 15,000 duplicate loans. So businesses were applying on multiple occasions for the loan when they're only entitled to one loan.
Was that just maladministration by the Treasury? Is it just total ineptitude?
Yes, well, that's what I said in my resignation speech.
I mean, it's not obviously something that's been done on purpose, but it's just a lack of checking, a lack of oversight and a lack of auditing.
Correct.
How much do we think taxpayers lost during this period?
Well, it's very difficult to quantify it, because do you call a duplicate loan a fraud? So I don't know how they're calculating those, but how many of those who received more than one loan have paid them back?
Well, so, do we have an answer to that question?
Well, not to my knowledge.
Practically none would be my guess.
I suspect very few. So you've got those, and then you've got those who are actually crooked. So there were 1,500 loans that went out to companies that weren't even trading when COVID hit, because, again, of naivety. So there were a whole range of these issues. And then I did fight a rearguard action to try to recover this by getting additional resource. I only wrote one letter to the then Chancellor as my boss in the
Rishi
Treasury,
Sunak,
asking for more resource to go after this.
You wrote a really lengthy letter explaining the problems, what was happening, what was going wrong.
Correct.
And you laid it all out very early on. What was the response?
Not interested, really, other than, well, departments need to find the money from their own resources.
And why do you think he took that approach? Because he was overly concerned with furlough and his own performance during the pandemic, eat out to help out?
Well, I think he was overwhelmed by the crisis, and I can't blame the government for that, because it was unprecedented in peacetime. But it was frustrating that they weren't prepared to listen to someone with a business background who actually understood how this stuff worked.
Did you ever have any face-to-face discussions with him, or was it all by letter?
Well, and we met periodically. I mean, we met as a ministerial team on probably a fortnightly basis, but I couldn't get the message through.
But what are you saying, that it was fingers in ears, we don't want to hear this?
Pretty much, yeah.
It's depressing, that. I mean, as a long-serving Tory, you must have been quite upset.
Yeah. Well, the problem is it's the amount of money that's lost, which we'll come to this in a moment when we talk about economic growth and how we can create that. We're losing this money, which could be so much better used. And I mean, the National Audit Office put the figure at 30 billion a year in fraud loss in government before COVID. So
I mean, it's just an astonishing amount.
Now, you're not going to get all of that.
Before COVID?
Yes. So the problem has been endemic for a long time. So that's why the thing needs a real focus.
And you know what will incense our viewers and listeners is that if there's some problem, some slight anomaly with your tax return, HMRC will be down your throat before you can say, oh my goodness, where are my bank files? And yet at the same time, a blind eye has been turned to basically widespread fraud worth millions and billions.
There was also promise of a fraud bill in this Parliament.
What happened to that?
Well, it's disappeared. So
OK, so look, let's talk about growth. And I know you want to talk about sort of what more we could be doing for productivity, particularly. You said at the time, look, I'm resigning because if you did claw back some of this money, we could have income tax cuts. I take it you still think we should have income tax cuts?
Well, we have to be very careful at the moment because we are in a very perilous financial position. So we have a structural deficit each year where we are spending 85 billion more than we are generating in revenue from taxes. So, of course, I would like to see tax cuts, but we cannot. This is why the Truss government failed so quickly. She announced unfunded tax cuts, and the gilt markets, the international markets who lend us the money to keep going, they didn't like it. And that's
but did
why.
She have a point about trying to fight Treasury orthodoxy, changing the status quo, trying to stimulate more growth than this sort of flatlining figure that we've grown used to, that many describe as managed decline?
No, 100% she was on the right track, and getting rid of the then head of the Treasury, Tom Scholar, was a good move.
Was it? Because people say that was part of the reason the markets were spooked and that Kwasi Kwarteng showed arrogance in doing that.
Well, he was a main blocker to I mean, I had to deal with him when I was a minister.
Scholar was?
Yes.
What do you mean?
Well, he was simply manage the status quo, manage decline, and bring all this control of the finances to the centre and in a short-term way. And we'll discuss a little bit about that on the school buildings later.
Yeah, but just tell me about the attitude, because obviously you've had this kind of front row seat inside the Treasury, and we've heard so much criticism over the years from people who are more on the right, people who are more of a Brexit persuasion, saying that there's groupthink. What's wrong with the Treasury as a whole? They're left-wing, they're economically completely opposed to kind of Thatcherite economics. What's the deal?
The first thing is the average age is 29.
Right.
So you have very bright people with very, very little lived experience. So they haven't been out in the front line of business, creating wealth. They've never been there. They've been to a smart university and then they go into the Treasury. And the turnover of staff there is colossal. It's 25% or something like that.
Yeah.
So you're losing. So you don't get the traction of people who become expert in the way in their portfolios because they're moving so quickly. On top of that, they try to micromanage the whole of government. So tiny sums of money will end up with them being scrutinised, whereas they lose sight of the big picture. So
they block policies all the time because they're looking for the bottom line. We're fast running out of time because it's been so fascinating speaking to you. Let's just talk about RAC briefly. You were schools minister. Did you know that this concrete was a problem waiting to happen back in the day?
It's been on the agenda for years.
Should the government have done more about it preemptively? Because obviously closing down school classrooms 2 days before the start of term seemed a little bit after the event. Well,
they could have done it at the beginning of the holidays, couldn't they?
Well, couldn't they? But why don't they?
You'll have to ask them that. I've been out of the department for a long time. But I had probably 10 meetings with the Treasury when I was also the Capital Schools Minister, so I had the envelope of Schools Capital when I was there, and I was trying to get them to give me a long-term envelope. So I said, give me a 10-year envelope of money. It doesn't have to be any more, but then I can go out to the building industry and say, here is a 10-year programme so that you can tool up for dealing with these refurbishments.
And?
Well, they wouldn't do it. They said it has to sit within the spending review. But I said to them, well, are we not going to have any schools at the end of the spending review? I said, what's going to happen after the year or the 3-year spending review? And of course, they don't have an answer to that.
So you seem to be saying that a lot of these roadblocks when it comes to the government trying to enact its own policies, or indeed ministers like you coming up with ideas to solve problems, are constantly being blocked by the Treasury?
Continually. Which is why one thing I pushed for when Truss was briefly in power was you need to take a responsibility for economic growth from the Treasury and have a small team directly answerable to the Prime Minister who deliver on that. Because that's the most important agenda. I mean, I know we're running out of time, but Camilla, it's just important to give you a couple of numbers. So the share of if you compare us to America over the last 20 years, our percentage of per capita income has fallen steadily. Yeah. So we now, as a country, rank just above Alabama. So, and we have fallen progressively over the last 20 or 30 years. And if we could increase per capita GDP by 3%, within 15 years, that would be another £650 billion a year in revenue. Forget inflation, but just to take the simple numbers. So you'd get your tax cut. So that would allow you to cut taxes by 35%.
Yeah.
And continue to properly fund public services.
But then the trouble, to conclude, Lord Agnew, is bring in a Chancellor that wants to challenge the status quo, or indeed a Prime Minister, and they last, a matter of days? Yes,
but she could have handled it a lot better. But you're right.
But is Jeremy Hunt similarly taken hostage?
I suspect so.
Lord Agnew, thank you very much indeed for your expertise this morning.
Thank you.
Very interesting to speak to you.